Hey everyone, this is John from EastCoastArmory.com, and I'm here today with a model showcase video for this 1/35th scale M4A1 early production Sherman tank. The model that you see here is built for my own personal collection and is not for sale and or purchase. However, like I often mention in these smaller scale build videos, I often take on commission build projects from models ranging from 1/35th scale all the way up to 1/6 scale. As for availability and pricing information, this information would be best by contacting me through the email address listed below, which is info@eastcoastarmory.com. The model that you see here is built mostly out of the box, however does feature several aftermarket additions, of which we'll be going over in more detail in this video. First, let's take a quick walk around the model. This vehicle here is an M4A1 Sherman tank. This vehicle differs from the standard M4 Sherman with the composition of the hull. The upper hulls found on the welded style Sherman tanks feature both rolled and cast steel components, which are welded together in a jig to form a mosaic, which once complete gives you the shape of the upper hull. The M4A1 in comparison forgoes all of those other components and features a one-piece all-cast hull. This style of construction does offer some benefits, namely first is that of ease of construction. Rather than having a bunch of components that need to be casted, rolled, cut, and then all welded together nice and seamlessly to form the hull, the piece is simply done in one mold and is casted. Once the casting is done, the piece is then thread and then mounted to the lower hull, thus saving production time. Also, the cast all-round shape of the cast hull does offer slight ballistic protection in that the hull is equally protected on all angles as opposed to the straight slides of the welded configuration. In addition to that, the welds can also be argued to be a weak point as the all-cast is a solid unit and does not have any separation type issues that can emerge with welded designs. When the Sherman was being developed, it was actually intended from the get-go to have the all-cast round hull. However, one drawback that the round hull has was that the amount of tooling required in order to produce the molds as well as the original patterns was a time-consuming affair. It was during this time engineers developed the mosaic welded hull as a stopgap measure in order to produce the necessary units in the speed required by the War Department. All of these issues were solved and were perfected, and the M4A1s went into production and continued into production all the way throughout the rest of the war and throughout the Sherman's production run. Even towards the latter half of the war, when the larger bow hatches were developed, the M4A1 had its hull redesigned in order to accommodate this new pattern of hatch. These production batches replaced the small hatch run and continue all the way throughout the end of the war. Even though the M4A1s were in production, the welded variations of the Sherman were also being perfected as well and simplified. These versions too were in production alongside the M4A1s all the way up again till the end of the war and also to the end of the Sherman's production run. Beyond the upper hull, the rest of the M4A1 was identical to that of the M4 Sherman, that being the type of engine as well as transmission and other fittings which were found on the M4, all of which were also found on the M4A1. For the power pack, the tank featured the Continental radial engine, which was also used on the Lee, M4, as well as M7. The M4A1 continued to use this power pack even with the upgraded hull design of the larger bow hatches. Because these vehicles were in production for a long duration of time, a large number of them were produced. And these vehicles saw extensive action during World War II with not only the United States, but as well as its allies in all theaters of operation. These countries utilized the Sherman all throughout the war, and then after the war, a large number of these tanks wound up being sold as surplus to other countries, namely Israel, as well as several other countries in South America. Before I go any further with the video, let's go ahead and take a step back to before the model was first started in order to get a good idea on what the base starter kit started like. And here's the model just prior to assembly. For the base starter kit, I'll be utilizing this early production M4A1 Sherman tank from Dragon. The kit itself is a vintage kit. These were released by Dragon in the mid-1990s, more specifically 1996. Just like with the vintage Dragon Firefly video that I recently did, I described that these kits in that video were the second batch of Sherman tank kits to be released by Dragon. If we can recall, the Dragon tooling itself is actually heavily based off of the Taillights M4 Sherman tank tooling. However, by this time here, Dragon went ahead and made some alterations to the parts in order to make it more of their own. Starting with the model's box art, as you can see, it's the M4A1. In the back, you have the inflatable fake Sherman to be used to confuse the Germans, specifically during the lead up to Normandy. And you have the crew just getting a good gag at laughing at the inflatable tank. One thing I always found funny about this particular box art is that the tank commander itself has a striking resemblance to John Travolta. Moving on from Barbarino, takes us to the rest of the tank's graphic design. As you can see, you have some pictures of the completed model, as well as your typical standard type layout for Dragon kits of this period. This particular kit you see here was acquired off of eBay a few years ago and has been sitting in the stash for a little while, which is evident from the dust which is on the surface of the box. Digging into the box takes us to the actual kit components themselves. Starting with the first bag, it's that of the tank's turret. The tank's turret has some nice cast-in detailing, as well as some other finely molded-in component detailing out of box. The turret does have some British-esque components, namely that of the external radio box and what appears to be the British rubberized radio antenna base. This is the similar type of detailing which was discussed in more detail in the Firefly video which I recently completed. Also on this runner you have several options for mantlets. This version here is for the early style mantlet, which was a thin little sliver, and here's your standard later version of the mantlet with the cheek armor found. Also in this bag here you have some more components out of a 3-piece transmission cover, which is lifted from their M4A4, as well as some track links, which are the 3-rivet style pattern, which is very common for British style Shermans. Moving deeper takes us to the actual hull runner itself. This component here has all the components which will be used on this build, as they are specifically intended for this kit that I'm building here. Here we have the upper hull. This is the early pattern of the M4A1 with that of the thinner, smaller profile bow hatches. As most Sherman fans know, that this design here was later altered in order to have a larger style hatch, which made exit and entering of the vehicle a lot more easy with the crew. Detailing is pretty good. You have some very nice cast texturing found on the entire piece. You have the tarpaulin mount for the 1919 that has its little clips pre-molded in, and you also have the Super G logo for, I believe, the General Steel Company. Here goes the front transmission cover. Again, nice quality in cast texturing, as well as some foundry marks which are found on the piece. Going to the bottom takes us to the lower hull. This here is where you're going to start seeing a lot of the Taillights-esque detailing. Starting with the lower hull. If anyone has built the Taillights tanks in the past, you'll know exactly what I'm referring to. You have here the molded in parts for the instrument panel, as well as the 2 small boxes, which are found primarily used on the Italeri M32 recovery vehicle, as well as their M7 Priest. The form-fitting suspension, as well as the sprockets, are almost direct copies from the Italeri, which was also mentioned in the Firefly video. This runner here contains more Dragon-specific components. These parts here have been tweaked from the Italeri tooling in order to make them a little bit more detailed. However, still have the same basic function as the Italeri parts. These pieces do have some nice fine detailed casted in features, and the road wheels are also nicely done as well. This bag here takes us to the individual track links. Like what was seen, this tank also features a different pattern of track. Before it was the 3-bar or the 3-rivet style chevron. This one here is the all rubber style chevron track. For the type of track that you see here, the pieces are finely molded and are nicely detailed. However, like I'll soon mention, will not be utilized on this build. Here we have the decal sheet, and on the bottom of the box takes us to the photo etch. Just like I mentioned in the Firefly video, Dragon kits of the period did feature some photo etch components, which made them a lot more improved and stood out from the other companies at the time, namely Italeri as well as Tamiya. Finally, the bottom of the box takes us to the instructions, which are typical for Dragon and should be more than suffice in aiding with the construction of this model. As you can see, there are several different ways to build the kit out of the box. And on the back here, you can see that there are a lot of redundant components which will be used and put into spare parts. As you've seen from the unboxing, this kit here utilizes static individual track links, which were a staple of Dragon tank kits of the period. If anyone is a fan of my videos, you will know that I have an utmost disdain for this style of track. And these tracks here will not be utilized on this build. In their place, I'll be replacing those tracks with a set of single-piece rubber or vinyl tracks from AFV Club. I have reviewed several of these tracks in the past and utilized them on numerous builds. These tracks here are very nicely done and are a great substitute for the stock kit tracks. For the pattern that you see here, I'll be utilizing the T49 3-bar cleat style track, as this track here was probably the most prolific and easy to find off of Amazon.com, as well as also on eBay. Starting with the model suspension, the suspension that you see on the model is all built out of box with no mods necessary. As you saw from the unboxing, the kit supplies you with 2 styles of VVSS suspension, the more traditional Italeri style and the upgraded style. The upgrade style, which is the units that you see here, are more improved than the Italeri versions in that they have the 3 fastener bolts that are located on the bottom portion of the bogies. They also feature the fasteners for the skid rail. These components are absent on the older style tooling. As for the wheels, they too are the stock versions and are nicely detailed out of box. They are simply painted and added to the model. Now, the one nice little feature is that the small Zerk fittings are molded into these wheels, and like I always mention, a quick brush of red paint greatly helps the look and makes them pop. Same could also be said for the Zerk fittings on the return rollers as well. As for the sprockets, again, they give you several different styles. This is the style which would be more appropriate for this early production Sherman. One mod that I made was I drilled out the center portion of the hub, which a small little divot is found on all Sherman sprockets. As for the idler, like again, basic Sherman, it's steel colored, as there are no rubber rimmed VVSS rear idler wheels for the Sherman. And again, the same mod was also done, or more like feature, was also done to the return rollers.
One modification that I made to the VVS suspension to improve its accuracy was that of the 4 fastener holes, which were located on the bogie housings. These were a simple addition with a Dremel, and once added, also make the tank stand out from its stock counterpart. One feature that's found on these Dragon Shermans, it's more or less a carryover, is that since they are based off of the Taillights suspension, they are form-fitting, as you can see here, which takes us directly to the track. Like I mentioned in the unboxing, the track is the AFV Club 3-bar vinyl track. The vinyl track is a simple drop-in replacement of the Dragon Lincoln Link tracks. Once installed, they really improve the look of the model, and they do contour very nicely and mount effortlessly to the suspension. They are a little bit on the tight side, however, I had no issues when it came mounting the suspension to the track. One thing to watch out for is that due to the tightness of the track, you will have a slight bend in the first and last bogie. This is standard, and it's also typically found on Taillights tanks, which I've kind of termed the Taillights bend. If you push down on the tank, though, it does alleviate the bend somewhat. As for the vinyl track, to replicate the metal look, the track is painted with NATO black. The NATO black, in my opinion, gives a good representation of that oxide color, which is applied to metal portions of tank tracks. The T49 track, which is the 3-bar cleat, is all metal. There's no rubber components on it, so you would need to have the brushed or scratched steel surfaces for the track face, as well as a worn interior portion where the rubber always makes contact with the inside portion of the steel track. While on the front, one mod that I made was the addition of the fender supports that are found on the front fenders. All Shermans have these. These that you see here are fabricated out of strips of thin aluminum, which are bent, glued, and installed in place. Also, of course, on the front of the Sherman, no Sherman is complete without its small little cups for the headlight plungers. Again, this was fabricated in my usual format, and it also, once added to the build, also greatly helped the accuracy of the model. Finally, another addition that I made was to the fender-mounted siren. Like all early production, very early pattern Sherman tanks, the siren was located on top of the fender without a brush guard. This was moved in later incarnations, where the siren was moved to this location here, or even in the center, and had some kind of a brush guard apparatus to protect it. While on the fender, I went ahead and mounted and fabricated the little power cable for the siren. Just a little piece of wire, but again, a nice little addition that also helps the look of your model. The rest of the tank's hull is pretty much standard and built mostly out of the box. The kit does feature some very nice photo etch grills for the track grouser storage locations. At the time when this kit came out, this was actually something that was cutting edge and was something that really made the Dragon kit stick out from the other companies of the period. While on the back, I am at the taillights. As we can see, like with most of my builds, the taillight on the left-hand side has its red painted cat's eye, while on the opposite side it's blacked out. This is as per the real vehicles. Also, just like with all USAFV taillights, the top portion is your colored lens, while the white light is a little stripe below. This is a mirrorage on both sides. Moving our way up to the turret. Again, just like with the hull, it's mostly built out of the box. The stock gun barrel was used, and no problems arose where any need to replace it with a aftermarket one. This does have the early style mantlet without the cheap armor pieces, and the 30 caliber machine gun has a guard around it as well. This is a typical feature found on these early pattern Shermans. It's also important to note that you can also have the machine gun without this piece of armor for an even earlier rendition than the one that you see here. One mod that I did make, though, was to the antenna base. The stock kit recycles the British antenna base from their M4A4 British Sherman series. The antenna base is nicely done, and it's a piece of photo etch. However, it's inaccurate for an American Sherman. That antenna base was put in my spare parts bin, and in its place, I went ahead and utilized the Panzerart CNC'd Brass MP48 Spring antenna base. This piece here was spare from my M4A1 heavy tank build, which I recently completed. of which, like I mentioned in that video, the antenna bases are highly recommended and are literally beautifully done. Their spring detailing, insulator detailing is all present, and the antenna wire is a very high quality. The piece was a simple drop-in installation with absolutely no bonds really necessary, other than maybe drilling out the hole for the antenna base. Other than that, a strongly recommended add-on to any 1/35th scale American tank from World War II. One other modification that I did make to the turret that is an easy mod to make that also does help the look of the model is adding that of the drainage holes. In the back area here of the antenna well, a small hole has been drilled in, and 2 smaller holes have been drilled into the back portion here of the ventilator. These are found on the real tank and are, again, really simple to add, and when added also really do help the look of the model compared to, again, its stock configuration. Moving our way to the front portion of the turret takes us to the tank's vane sight. This version of the Sherman would have the early shark fin style vane sight. The vane sight that you see here is comprised out of 2 pieces as per the real vehicle. You have a thicker portion which is integrally mounted to the tank, and then there's a thinner sheet metal portion which on the real tanks would be bolted on. The kit does supply you with the vane sight thicker piece. However, the thinner piece is absent. For the thinner piece, I went ahead and fabricated that out of a simple piece of thin aluminum. Same aluminum that I used on the fender strips from before. Piece was simply mounted, and then after the tank was painted, a nice little swipe of red paint was added in my usual format to give the piece a little bit more spice. Moving our way to the machine gun. One portion that is actually missing on this tank is that of an anti-aircraft machine gun. No Sherman, in my opinion, is complete without one, and in the place of the M2HB, I went ahead and rummaged through my spare parts bin and found a nice modern Dragon M1919A4 with the M1917 tripod mount. The gun was simply assembled out of the Dragon box, with the exception of the piece was actually made to rotate. The 1917 tripod mount is capable of mounting into the 50 caliber pistol mount, which is found on the copula, so the piece is accurate for this build. And having a 1919 is not necessarily out of commonplace seen in period photographs. The 1919 itself is nicely done, like I mentioned, with a drilled out barrel and nicely detailed tripod base, complete with ammo can. While on the machine guns, I also went ahead and dremeled out the bow 1919, which was found before. This was the only mod actually needed for the machine gun, as the kit machine gun, in my opinion, was workable. The coaxial 1919 came pre-drilled out from the company, which is also a nice feature. As for the model's paint and markings, the model's painted in a Italian theater camouflage pattern, which is that of a sand color over the US olive drab. In addition to the camouflage pattern, as for the markings that you see here are not the ones that were supplied with the stock DML kit. The kit does supply you with a decent set of markings. However, the markings that they give you are kind of sparse and want you to build a certain type of tank, namely the Sherman Weenie One. The reason why I did not make that tank Weenie One was to make it Weenie One, you needed actually a 3-tone camouflage pattern, as that's what has been discovered in some photographs of the actual tank. And on top of that, Weenie One has some other features, namely that of a M2HB. And as for the track would be the rubber chevron type. For me to mark this tank as Weenie One with this camouflage pattern and this track and a few other smaller bits missing, it would have been inaccurate. Rather than go that route, I went ahead and rummaged through my spare decal bin and found these decals, which were spare from the early production welded M4 Sherman from Tamiya that I recently finished. Those decals were added in its place and were a simple swap. The decals from the Tamiya kit are very nicely done and lacquered on and were applied with absolutely no issues and/or hang-ups. As for difficulty rating, since the model is really based off the Taillights Sherman, anyone who has assembled an Taillights Sherman can level up and assemble one of these kits here. Also, if anyone has built any of the Tamiya Shermans, can also navigate through the kit and assemble a decent build. The model, like I mentioned before, built very easy and mostly effortlessly, with the caveat of swapping out the tracks with the rubber ones. The AFV Club tracks are highly recommended for this kit here, and do really simplify the build and make it a much more enjoyable build for the model maker. As for, again, a difficulty rating, possibly someone who's a beginner who has built 1 or 2 tanks, all the way up to an advanced model builder, can assemble one of these kits with little issues. With, of course, again, the caveat being the track. As for proliferation, these kits here are vintage. They're no longer in production. So snagging one on some of the major e-tailers like Amazon.com is not going to be an option. These kits here are still found on eBay from time to time, as well as you might get lucky and find one in a local hobby shop, in a stash somewhere. However, in my opinion, these kits are well worth the money and build, again, very nicely. Also, the subject matter of the tank itself is also very interesting. It is a M4A1 all-cast hull with the small hatches, and some of the other features, namely on the mantlet, as well as some of the other components which are found on the build, do lend itself for a nice unique addition for the Sherman family tree. I recommend this kit for anyone who's a Shermanaholic like myself, or someone who wants to differentiate their Shermans in their collection. Like I said in the other Sherman video, no tank collection is complete with at least one M4 Sherman, and no Sherman collection is complete with at least one M4A1. And while on the subject of recommendations, here I have the Dragon M4A1 compared with the Tamiya early production M4 that I mentioned earlier. Here you get a good idea of the two different style of hulls. This one here being welded, while this one here being all cast. As difficulty-wise in comparing the two, the Dragon Sherman is technically simpler to build than the Tamiya, in that the Tamiya, if we recall, I had to actually fabricate the sponsons, which were missing on the stock Tamiya kit. That procedure is not necessary on the Dragon. However, the Dragon, like I said before, does require some aftermarket parts, namely that of track, in order to build the tank a lot more easily compared to the stock offering. The Tamiya kit has the decent vinyl tracks supplied with the kit and are not needed as aftermarket. As for prices, the Tamiya kit is a lot more prolific and can be had anywhere between $30 to $40 US, while the Dragon kit is slightly more rare, but prices can be had from anywhere between $30 to approximately $50. And that concludes this model showcase video for this 1/35th scale M4A1 early production Sherman tank. If you like this video, stop by and like us on Facebook. And don't forget to check out eastcoastarmory.com for more 1/6 and 1/16 scale builds and detail components. Thank you.